In this video, we're reviewing the subreddit r/pettyrevenge. This family found a smart way to get rid of annoying neighbors while camping. Enjoy! Every summer from May until the end of September, my family, hubby, kid, me, and two other families, one with 2 kids and one with no kids, go camping about every other weekend or so. We always have a great time together. We camp close to the river so the kids can swim and the guys can fish. There are small rapids close by that we walk down to and float back to camp during the day. At night, we build a bonfire and the adults sit around talking and having a few drinks while the kids pile up in a tent to hang out or go exploring close by with flashlights to see what is out at night. We always put our tents close together but as far away from the edges of the site as possible, so we can have some privacy and don't disturb other campers. The campground rules state that quiet time runs from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. We have been going on these trips for several years and never had any problems or issues with other campers or campground staff. Over this past summer, we were camping and someone pulled into the campsite next to ours pretty late, maybe 7 or 8 p.m., but set their tent up on part of our site and immediately went into their tent. They had a kayak on their vehicle and we assumed they were gonna have an early morning, so we didn't say anything about it to them since it was late, dark, and we didn't think it was a big deal. Fast forward to 5 minutes past 10 p.m. and someone from the front desk comes to our site and tells us they had a noise complaint about our site. The guy said the staff making rounds didn't hear us or feel we were being loud, but since they had someone call up there, they had to come talk to us. We apologized for any issues we may have caused and agreed to be quieter in case we were disturbing anyone. Maybe half an hour later, the guy comes back and says they had another call and asks us if we have heard any other people because he couldn't hear us until he got past our tents and thought maybe the complainer was accusing the wrong site. We kind of looked around because we haven't heard anyone else. There's a few other sites with people sitting around fires, but we hadn't heard anyone. However, as we are glancing around, I notice that our site neighbor is peeking out their tent at us talking to the groundskeeper. When he saw me looking, he quickly ducked back into his tent. His tent on our site and basically dry humping our tents, which is probably why he could hear us so easily. After the groundskeeper left, I decided to look up the campground rules. Nothing about lights out, just quiet time. So I took one of our bright shop lights and moved it as close as possible to their tent, turned it on and left it shining like a spotlight on their tent all night long. The next morning when we all got up, they were gone. We were there for 5 more days with absolutely no issues. Next story. A few years back, I was working retail in the south of England. I had just dropped out of university and was having something of a crisis of what I was doing with my life. I saw a position for a marketing assistant in London and went for it. I turned up for the interview and the waiting room was full of people leaving. Me thinking, damn, a lot of people are gunning for this role. It was a bit strange. Sometimes large groups of them would be whisked out the door at a time, and I didn't know what to make of it at that moment. I was pulled in for my interview, and this guy was nice enough, starts painting the company as a paradise. He showed me a bunch of charts indicating all the progression opportunities, and it started sounding a bit too good to be true. I was a bit concerned, so I stressed that I was looking for an office job, and he assured me that most of my time would be in the office. He didn't even really ask me anything, just what I was doing at the time and sent me on my way. 2 hours later, I received an email inviting me for my second interview, which was the next day. I would have to try to take another day out of my current job, but I was keen. I traveled back to London the next day for the interview first thing in the morning and got back to their headquarters to find the waiting room was once again full. I get introduced to a gentleman, a bit of a slimy character, who tells me he'll be my assessor for the day. I haven't been given any indication on what I'll be assessed on, so I'm a bit on edge. He turns to me and tells me that we'll be out until 8 p.m., maybe a bit later. Out? Out where? Assessor. Oh, don't worry too much. We're just going to take to the streets and go over the fundamentals of marketing a bit, together. You have a notepad with you? Good. He leads me at the same time as many other assessors lead many other candidates from the waiting room out to the streets. We all kind of split off and he leads me to the tube station, telling me I need to buy a ticket to another station a considerable distance away. I'm a bit pissed at this point because I'm wondering why I'm expected to spend 10 hours with this guy and pay for this ticket to join him. We sit on the tube and he starts asking me to jot down the marketing fundamentals as he's speaking. I'm getting increasingly agitated and begin to pause him and question him on what we're doing. Assessor: well, I'll be marketing in the streets and then I'll be assessing your ability to do the same. You know, to see if you're a good fit. Me: I was told this was an office job? Assessor: we have an office, yes, but we work on the streets marketing our partners' products. It now fully hit me why they were carrying out these mass interviews. I had a suspicion, but I didn't want to believe it for a while. It really just seemed like free labor on quite a large scale. Every hour, masses of employees partnered with interviewees were being sent out as pairs to sell their products. I was so furious in that moment, having been lied to about the job, having lost out on money at work, and gotten my hopes up. Meanwhile, this guy was barking at me on the tube to pay attention and note down his top 5 marketing buzzwords of the day, and telling me the story of his colleague who quit studying medicine at Imperial College just because this job was so great. With each passing stop, the temptation grew greater and greater to abandon him on the tube. As we were approaching about the 5th or 6th stop, without really thinking, I just started pretending I had seen someone outside the train that I hadn't seen for years. Me: Is that? Assessor: What is it? I need your attention. Me: I think I just saw… No way. I just have to… I'll be right back. Assessor: But the train! Then I jumped up and hopped off the train. I was so mad that I didn't even turn back to see him. And then I was so mad that I didn't actually speak my mind to him. I spent the rest of the day walking around London before catching the train home. I'm actually glad nothing came of the job, else I wouldn't have moved north and met my wife. Edit: when I got home, I had received another email asking me to attend my second interview again the next day. Next story. I was in college, senior. My roommate was a sophomore, but it was his first time living in a dorm. He'd been a pretty lousy roommate, constantly left the room a mess, left his stuff on my side of the room and on my bed, stole my alcohol, used my chute without permission, never cleaned up my dishes after he used them, and a bunch of other stuff. I confronted him about all these issues on several occasions and got the resident assistant involved with the alcohol stealing issue because at the time, he was under 21. Things still continued anyways. He asked me once if it was okay if his girl spent the night, which I said no. We were in the middle of a pandemic, plus that's especially weird if I was there. I also had to wake up every day at 8 a.m. for work, which he knew, and he would stay up until 2 a.m. playing video games some nights. Not to mention, he would set like 10 alarms in the morning with a bunch of different alarm tones. I hit a breaking point and decided to do something cruel. Every morning, when I woke up, I'd observe his alarm pattern and how he'd respond. He had several alarms that he'd ignore, all with the same sound. He had a couple of half-hour alarms that had a unique sound, also ignored. And then the final alarm had its own sound too. All of them were default iPhone sounds. So his brain had been trained to this alarm pattern for a while, I'd assumed. So I started step 1 of the punishment. Set up a sequence of alarms on my phone, identical to his sequence, but an hour early. He responded to my alarms the exact same way he'd respond to his own. I kept this up for a week and his brain was eventually retrained to sleep through double the amount of alarms as before. Then, phase 2 kicked in. Random inconsistencies in my alarm pattern. Other days, I'd play all the alarms, while other days, I'd only play one that his brain was trained to ignore. That way, his brain expects to sleep through like 20 alarms and only ever hears 11. He slept through his alarm at least 4 times in 2 weeks. Eventually, he finally changed his alarm pattern so he'd only have 1 alarm, and he no longer had the energy to stay up until 2 a.m. Next story. In the late 90s, I worked at a Subway restaurant, specifically closing shift. That'll be relevant later. At the time, I was paid somewhere between $7 and $8 an hour, a good chunk more than minimum wage, and had me bringing my A game every day. I knew it was just fast food, but I took pride in my work. I showed up early, always covered when people called in, followed the recipes, even the really anal stuff like 2 slices of black olive per 6-inch sub unless the customer specifically requests more, etc. By all accounts, I was a model employee. Plus, since I worked alone, I was the de facto shift supervisor. That's gotta be worth something. I figured I'd ask the regional manager for a raise. Store manager didn't have the authority. The worst he can do is say no, right? Wrong. Turns out the worst he can do is insult me and everyone else that works there. He was in one day and I made my pitch. He just went off on me, raising his voice shy of a full yell and saying something like, "If you were worth more, you wouldn't be working here. You're replaceable. Now go away and don't ever speak to me again. I'm the regional manager and I'm actually important. You just make sandwiches and scrub toilets." Again, not the exact words, but he did make those points quite clearly. I remember being shocked into silence at such a cartoonish display of arrogance coming out from a balding middle-aged man. First time I'd ever encountered a .50 caliber douchebag. I didn't even specify an amount, I just asked for a raise. He could have given me a nickel or even made something up like, "I'm sorry, wages are set by corporate, I can't do it." And while I'd have been disappointed, I'd have accepted it. But no, his response to the very concept of any raise was a pretentious, self-righteous indictment against the value of every Subway employee that wasn't management, or probably him specifically. I genuinely enjoyed working there, right up until that watershed moment. Okay, Cheese D, if that's how you want it, fine. I'll get mine one way or another. I take pride in my work, but 7-something an hour isn't enough to engender any further loyalty after you so flippantly insulted me and everyone working for you. Up until that point, I had been meticulous about everything I did at work. Like I mentioned earlier, closing shift was a one-man show, which meant I had no supervision. My effectiveness was judged based on the accuracy of my inventory numbers, counting my till, my clock out times, and whether everything was in order when the openers arrived in the morning. I knew a few tricks to offset inventory which allowed me to take home food without it being noticed. Ring up a small soda as a cheese round, since they were both 89 cents, etc. On a good night, I'd take home a dozen or more footlong subs. On a bad night, I'd just make sandwiches with the loaf of bread I brought from home. I'd also bring in a bunch of empty bottles or jugs and fill them from the fountain after clocking out. I'd dump entire Cambros full of meat, veggies, and cheese into a bag to take home. Sometimes I'd bake an oven full of cookies with the express purpose of taking them, if I could do so without using up the rest of a box, because a box with one raw cookie was counted the same as an unopened box. The moment he made it clear what I was worth to him, I started looking for a different job. If he'd given me a token 3% cost of living increase, it'd have amounted to maybe 25 cents per hour. They had me working around 30 to 35 hours a week, just below full-time, so it would have amounted to under $9 a week. Hell, he could have even offered a sincere apology and no raise, and I would have kept on with it. Instead, for the last few months I worked there, every single night I took home what probably amounted to a couple $100 worth of potential sales. Every single night. At the time, my friends and I, being late teens and early 20s, were still in the party phase of our lives. So every night I worked for those last months, I'd roll up just as the party was getting wild with a bunch of sandwiches, cookies, gallons of soda, etc. Those few months doing the bare minimum and sponging off that dead-end job were way more satisfying than giving my all for 7 and change for an insufferable bag of septic slop. Next story. I, 34-year-old male, was about 13 or 14 at the time, and my twin brother, Henry, used to always jump out at me from around the corner in the upstairs corridor. His room was at the end of the house, and my room was just as you turned right on a blind corner into the corridor after coming up the stairs. When he heard me coming up the stairs, he would get into position and time the jump, scream, shout to perfection, and revel in my reaction. This reign of terror lasted more than 5 years without any successful retaliation, but not for the want of trying, he was just very aware of being jumped out on. Anyway, the years go by and the need for revenge builds up constantly within me. One day, I heard my mom call Henry down as his school shirts had been ironed. UK schools have uniform, and I saw my opportunity. I heard him go past my room and down the stairs. As soon as I heard the first step down, I moved silently towards his room. As I enter his room, I see my target hiding place. I enter the wardrobe and move the clothes already in there to cover me up, leaving space on my left for him to hang the shirts. I close the wardrobe doors and start my patient wait. I waited for what felt like an eternity, probably more like 90 seconds, then hear him coming down the corridor, and I focused on being still as possible and breathing slowly and quietly. The unsuspecting Henry opens his wardrobe. He doesn't see me, and I stay frozen. The first shirt is put in, and I feel the sleeve brush my arm, still undetected. As he is hanging his last shirt, this is the moment I launch my attack. I burst out from behind his clothes and scream as I grab his shoulder with one hand and pull my face towards his face with the other hand. Henry's face is contorted into a look of pure terror, and he lets out an inhuman screech. I continue to get up in his face, making my own weird face, and he lets out another cry of fear. As the seconds go on, the realization starts to creep in, and though I get another squeal from him, my need for revenge is satiated, and he falls to the floor in relief and shock. With all the commotion, Mom is shouting from downstairs asking, "What the bloody hell is going on?" I walk downstairs and explain, which makes her laugh and congratulate me in a strangely proud way, knowing my years of torment led this moment. This happened 20 years ago. My twin and I live thousands of miles apart now, but when I miss him, I think of funny things like this and remember just how sweet the feeling of teenage retribution really is.